Hello. Abraham tweeted me yesterday and said, because it's Halloween, shall we both go in costume? And I said, yes, let's both go in costume. It's good. I haven't been able to shame anyone this year. It's like the worst thing about writing a book that's against public shaming is that I'm not allowed to shame anyone anymore, but this is like the closest I've got to that. Abraham has come as Hester Prynne. Okay, I'm going to talk for like maybe 15 minutes. I'm going to tell a story from my book and then read a little bit. I've been keeping a diary of what's happened since my book came out, and I'm going to read a little bit from that first, and then we're going to talk. So my book, in the early days of social media, it was kind of like a sort of place of, I think, kind of radical de-shaming. You know, people would admit shameful secrets to themselves. And other people would say, oh my God, I'm exactly the same. And then when powerful people misused their privilege, we realized that we could do something about it. We could get them. And we would get people, like if a newspaper ran a racist or a homophobic column, we could get them and we could hit them with a weapon that we understood and they didn't, social media shaming. And it felt good and powerful. But then I think what happened was that we fell in love with getting people who had misused their privilege so much that like a day without a shaming felt a little bit like a day treading water or picking fingernails. Like it began to feel weird and empty when there wasn't somebody who had misused their privilege that we could get. And into this atmosphere came a woman I'm going to tell you about very quickly called Justine Sacco. And she had 170 Twitter followers, and she would tweet little acerbic jokes to them, like this one on a plane from New York to London. And so she chuckled to herself and pressed send and got no replies and felt that sad feeling that we all feel when the internet doesn't congratulate us for being funny. And then she got to Heathrow and she had a few minutes to spare before her next leg from London to Cape Town. So she thought up another funny acerbic joke. So she got on the plane, turned off her phone, fell asleep, woke up 11 hours later, and there was a text. She turned on her phone when the plane was on the runway at Cape Town Airport, and there was a text from somebody she hadn't spoken to since high school that said, I am so sorry to see what's happening to you right now. And then there was another text from her best friend, Hannah, that said, you need to call me right now. You are the worldwide #1 trending topic on Twitter. So what had happened was that one of 170 Twitter followers had sent the tweet to a Gawker journalist called Sam Biddle, and he retweeted it to his 15,000 followers. A couple of weeks later, I contacted Sam Biddle and I asked him how it had felt to have started the campaign against Justine Sacco, and he said it felt delicious. And then he said, but I'm sure she's fine. But she wasn't fine, because while she slept, Twitter took control of her life and dismantled it. So first came the humanitarians, joined me in supporting CARE's work in Africa. I am donating to CARE today. Then came the beyond horrified. I am beyond horrified. Was anybody on Twitter that night? Yeah, so Justine's tweet overwhelmed your timeline the way it did mine. I thought that night what everybody else thought, which was, wow, somebody's fucked. And I kind of sat up in bed and put the pillow behind my head and waited. And then I thought, I'm not 100% sure that the joke was intended to be racist. Maybe instead of gleefully flaunting her privilege, maybe she was acknowledging her privilege and mocking it. There is a kind of comedy tradition of this, like South Park and Randy Newman. Maybe she was just, maybe Justine's crime was not being as good at it as Randy Newman. But if anybody else was feeling that night, nobody said anything. And instead it just started to get darker. And then came the calls for her to be fired. Hashtag getting fired. Thousands of people around the world decided it was their duty to get Justine fired. Sorry, not sorry. And then corporations got involved, hoping to sell their products on the back of Justine's annihilation. You know, a lot of... By the way, when I met Justine a couple of weeks later in a bar, and she was just crushed, and I asked her to explain the joke to me, and she said, living in America puts us in a bit of a bubble when it comes to what is going on in the third world. I was making fun of that bubble. Anyway, a lot of people were making good money out of Justine Sacco that night. Usually her name was Googled 40 times a month, but that night and for the few nights afterwards, her name was Googled 1,220,000 times, which meant Google made something like $468,000 out of Justine that night. Whereas those of us doing the actual shaming, we got nothing. It's like we were kind of unpaid shaming interns for Google. Anyway, then came the trolls. Justine was really uniting a lot of disparate groups that night, from humanitarians through to trolls, through to, as we will learn later on in the presentation, hipsters. Somebody else that night wrote, somebody HIV positive should rape this bitch and then we'll find out if her skin colour protects her from AIDS. And guess what? That person got a free pass. Nobody went after that person. It's like everyone was so excited about destroying Justine, and our shaming brains are so simple-minded. We couldn't handle also destroying somebody who was inappropriately destroying Justine. Honestly, that night we were like toddlers crawling towards a gun. You demented bitch. Women always get it worse than men. The language of violence, certainly. When a man gets fired, it's when a man gets shamed, it's I'm going to get you fired. When a woman gets shamed, it's I'm going to rape you. And retarded, racist bitch. And then Justine's employers got involved. And that's when the anger turned to excitement, because what we suddenly had was a delightful narrative arc. We knew something that Justine didn't. Justine was asleep on a plane, and she didn't know what we knew, which was that she was destroyed. Hashtag getting fired. Oh man, Justine Sacco was going to have the most painful phone turning on moment ever. We're about to watch this Justine Sacco bitch get fired in real time before she even knows she's getting fired. Well, bitch, how does it feel to be fired for Christmas? Somebody worked out exactly which plane she was on, and so they linked to a flight tracker website. And a hashtag started trending worldwide. Hashtag, has Justine landed yet? And guess what? Yes, there was. And if you want to know what it looks like to have just discovered that you've been torn apart for a misconstrued liberal joke while you were asleep on a plane and unable to explain your joke, and the people who tore you apart weren't crazy trolls by and large, but delightful people like us, this is what it looks like. Anyway, I wrote all of this in my book, and at the beginning of this year, the New York Times excerpted the book, and it was the Justine Sacco story, and I've been keeping a diary of what's happened since, and I'm just going to read a little bit from it. This will eventually be in the paperback of the book. Last Christmas, my US publisher sent me a box of Christmas cookies with a card that read, "Get some rest, 2015 is going to be a bumpy year." I emailed him to ask him what he meant. He replied that some people were going to hate the book. Oh, nobody's going to hate it, I thought. How could they? I'm right. In February, the New York Times magazine published my story about Justine, and Justine had been really worried, like she'd finally got herself a new job, and was my story going to bring it all back up again? But then she emailed me a couple of hours later and said, I've received a ton of feedback, people I don't know reaching out to show their support and commend me for handling that debacle with grace. Now, I say that not to be boastful, but because it just made me realise that what the cure for shame is, it's empathy. Condemnation began hesitantly at first, a little uncertain, like a consensus waiting to form. The article did nothing but bring her back into the spotlight when we'd all moved on, someone tweeted. Poor thing. Her dad is a billionaire, someone replied. I'm not too worried about her. I thought that was true about Justine, that her father was a billionaire, because that was all over Twitter. Let's not be fooled by Justine Sacco. Her father is a South African mining billionaire. She's not sorry, and neither is her father. People miss the point that Justine Sacco grew up the daughter of a white billionaire in South Africa. She doesn't care about losing a job, serial offender. So I asked Justine about her billionaire father, and she looked at me like she was nuts, like I was nuts, and said, my father sells carpets. But we need to dehumanize the people we hurt. It's why we call people sociopaths or garbage or whatever. That tweet didn't ruin her life, someone added. Justine Sacco has a new job. Give me a break already. After a year, I thought when I read that one. She got a new job after a year. Nice people like us had effectively sentenced Justine to a year's punishment for the crime of some poor phraseology in a tweet, as if some clunky wording had been a clue to her secret inner evil. The fact that she'd managed to doggedly pull things back together after a year was now being used as evidence that the shaming had been no big deal from the start. I remembered a time I was on a beach in Scotland and a flock of terns singled me out. They circled above me for a while and then began to dive bomb, pecking at my head. I ran back to the road shrieking and waving my arms in the air. You're too close to their eggs, my wife Elaine shouted after me. Elaine blames me for everything. The other day we were at a dinner party, and as I walked in, the host said, would you like some potato chips? And I said, no, thank you, I'm going to have cereal when I get home. And that was fair enough. And my wife was like mouthing at me, like, and I was like, what? And she was like, be more general. This early tentative disapproval felt like the turns circling, and then the dive bombing began. After reading that excerpt from his book, I think it's safe to say Jon Ronson is a fucking racist. An opinion was beginning to form and feed off itself that I'd written an attack on social justice, a defense of white privilege. In coming out against online shaming, I was silencing marginalised voices, because online shaming is the only recourse of the marginalised, whereas the world automatically allows people like Justine to succeed. But I just couldn't see how Justine's shaming made anything better, given that her joke was intended to mock racism. What happened to Justine struck me as just another terrible thing happening in the world. I wrote about Justine not because I identified with her, although I did, but because I identified with the people who tore her apart. I consider myself a social justice person. It was my people abusing our power. This wasn't social justice. It was a cathartic alternative. I decided to try and encourage those people to read the book, and so I tweeted, by the way, the Justine Sacco story in the New York Times isn't a standalone article, it's an extract from a book. And then I saw someone tweet, oh, now Ronson's saying it's an extract from a book. What did that mean? It was always an extract from a book. Did you think I ran home and quickly wrote a book? But I realised that anything I said in that moment would just be more evidence for the prosecution, and so I went back to being silent. Why isn't Jon Ronson replying to any of us? Someone tweeted. Because Jon Ronson only replies to men. Someone replied. I liked it when people went for me in ridiculous ways, because when I recounted those comments to other people, they made me look good. I didn't regret writing Justine's story. That's about the hardening of positions, right? That's one byproduct of all of this. Everybody's positions harden, and everybody takes polemical positions, and the grey area, which is where the truth lies, just gets lost. I didn't regret writing Justine's story. I was basically being told it's fine to write about those wronged people, but don't write about that wronged person because it makes us look bad. But a wronged person is a wronged person, even when they're an unfashionable wronged person. I visited a TV studio in New York to film a video about the book. There was a doctor on before me filming her own video. "What's your book about?" she asked me. "Online shaming," I said. "Oh, did you read that piece in the New York Times?" she said. "I wrote it," I said. "Oh, you must be so happy," she said. "Actually, I'm not," I said. "Why not?" she said. "Because there's a backlash with people calling me a racist," I said. "So what do you want?" she said. "Xanax," I said. She got out her pad and wrote me a prescription for 60 Xanax. When I got home and told my family that story, my son said to me, "Oh, you should have asked for Oxycontin." After that, I was no longer anxious, but I felt groggy. I had to weigh up whether to feel groggy or anxious. Later, I mentioned this to the comedian Joe Rogan. He said, "Welcome to America. That's our dilemma, groggy or anxious." Thank you.
Jon Ronson. Very well done, sir.
Thank you very much.
I was thinking on my way over here that I'm going to be sitting with such an interesting person that I could basically be a broomstick and these 30 minutes would probably fly by. But I'm going to aim to be something slightly more interesting than a broomstick, so maybe like a Ben Carson level. I want to start out with a little bit of a thought experiment based on the Justine Sacco story. So if we went back to December 2013, and you were in charge of Twitter and could control every single person's response to an episode like that, with no accounting for how human nature defaults to in cases like that, what would have been the ideal response?
Wait until she fucking lands and give it like, because that is justice. Because in justice, the defendant is allowed to talk for themselves. Yeah. And this happens like over and over again in social media shamings. It's always shoot first, ask questions later. And in fact, not only that, but actually calling, like when the flame is burning hot, even calling for patience, or curiosity, even calling for something as innocent as wait a minute until we get the facts. Yeah. You get destroyed. And that's happened to me this year. It happened with Rachel Dolezal. We were talking about the kind of hardening of positions, and I fell into that trap this year myself, I think, because I suddenly became, I was getting misdefined by people who hadn't read the book as a racist, right. and in response, I was misdefining myself as somebody who just felt the need to jump into any shaming, any ambiguous shaming, and take the kind of counterintuitive position. And so it happened with Rachel Dolezal, the woman who faked being black, the NAACP woman who faked being black. And, I thought, this is so amazing. What a mysterious, intriguing story. I wonder what Twitter's making out of it. So I went on Twitter, and it was like, she's no different to Nike appropriating hip-hop culture to sell sneakers, and she's a racist. And so I tweeted something like, because people kill themselves. Like a couple of weeks earlier, a guy had killed himself because of a Twitter shaming. Right. And so I sort of tweeted something like, I hope she's okay, nobody knows anything about her. And it was just ferocious. I went to dinner, and when I came back, somebody had set up a Twitter account imitating me, praising Dylan Roof, the man who killed 9 people in Charleston. So I wrote to Twitter and complained, and Twitter wrote back and said, we don't believe this is in contravention of our impersonation policy. And so I just thought, God, Twitter is such a doomed company that, we're unpaid shaming interns for a company that just doesn't care about us. But I also realized that day I was becoming like a caricature, I was becoming a meme. And even though I felt I was right about Rachel Dolezal, I was becoming a I was becoming an idiot.
Yeah, well, I didn't say that. I'm going to remove my bonnet for the next question. So Justine's story really breaks into two parts. There's her tweet itself, which probably would have been unremembered, and then there's the retweeting by Sam, the Gawker guy, who really turned it into a story.
And the fact that she was asleep, and that became just such a big part of the hilarity, that we were destroying this unaware woman.
Yeah.
And it was new, this was new. I think everybody was excited because it was new. It's like, this is new.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a way, and this is again maybe something that's so against the nature of Twitter that it's impossible, but is there a way to find something offensive, like the original tweet, and bring some kind of attention to it in a way that is fair and measured, instead of something that's ultimately going to turn into a huge pile-on where the punishment doesn't fit the crime?
Well, I mean, I think she's a kind of interesting case because it was it was an appalling combination of words, but the intent was liberal. So I think, so I see her differently as somebody who was intending to be offensive. She thought she was being smart, like Randy Newman.
And to say this for Randy Newman, you could directly tweet some of his 70s lyrics.
Oh, gee, of course, yeah.
And they would cause the same reaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to some extent, it's about the medium more than the content.
Yeah, it's about, it's the fact that Twitter is a kind of mutual approval machine in which we surround ourselves with people who feel the same way that we do, and we approve each other. And that sort of back and forward, that echo chamber of mutual approval is such a good feeling that when somebody gets in the way of it, we scream, we scream them out. And, we like to see social media as a new type of democracy, but screaming out any voices that we don't agree with is actually the opposite of democracy. And it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of social justice and idealism. And one of the ironies of Justine's story is that it was the need to be compassionate that was leading people to commit this profoundly uncompassionate act. But saying all of that, I mean, I'm not in any way calling for a return to offensive language or anything like that. I suppose what I'm saying is that, Twitter has created a stage for constant artificial high dramas where everybody's either a magnificent hero or a sickening villain. And in fact, we're not, by and large, magnificent heroes or sickening villains. We're clever and we're stupid. We're good and bad.
Right.
And we've forgotten that. And this stage for artificial dramas is making us lose our capacity for empathy, and more importantly, lose our capacity for distinguishing between serious and unserious transgressions. So, Justine, thank you. And so, Justine is being treated with the same level of ferocity as a racist cop from the McKinney, Texas pool party video. And if anybody in the crowd isn't on Twitter and thinks this story has got nothing to do with me because I'm not on Twitter and it's just a Twitter bubble, that's really not true, because the mainstream media, already insecure about its place in this new world, is allowing Twitter to set the agenda and is going along with it like the kind of nerdy child sucking up to the bully. And nobody defended Justine Sacco that night. We are supposed to speak truth to power. That's we're supposed to be fearless, but we're only fearless and speaking truth to power when the powerful people who are abusing their power are a long way over there, corrupt politicians or CEOs or big pharma or whatever. When the people abusing their power are the people on social media, everyone's too afraid to say anything. Because look what happens. Jon Ronson, you must be a fucking racist too.
Right.
Yeah.
So to hear you talking about Twitter in this manner, one might think that you were not on Twitter at all. In fact, I'm talking with somebody who's incredibly active on Twitter and has 130,000 followers. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you feel like Twitter is on balance more good than evil, and that's why it's still worth hanging out there? Do you feel like it's been helpful to you personally? I guess I would love to just hear your general thoughts about it.
Honestly, I think, okay, my guess is that in years to come, when people look back at these times, they'll see social media as being responsible for something incredibly good and something incredibly bad. Mm-hmm. And what was incredibly good was the new civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, mm-hmm. and what was incredibly bad was the collateral damage, mm-hmm. was the fact that it was creating this kind of more conformist society where people were afraid. Mm. So, yeah, I think, these times are making history, and that's how people will look back at it. Right. Great things happen on social media. When, the social justice movement is a great thing, and great things are happening. It's when it spirals out of control and turns into some kind of Stasi. But I think you have to look at the two things as separate things. Yeah. So, yeah.
It seems like a great medium for saying yes or no, or like or dislike to anything, and for any response that demands more subtlety or shades of gray, maybe the wrong medium entirely. Maybe there's no way to retrofit Twitter to accommodate opinions like that.
Maybe, or maybe, maybe this kind of babble of voices. As I say, I think one of the most shocking things that happened the night of the Justine Sacco incident was actually a woman called Helen Lewis, who writes for the New Statesman in England, reviewed my book and said that she was on Twitter that night and she tweeted something like, I'm not sure that joke was intended to be racist. And she said straight away she got this kind of fury of tweets saying, well, you're just a privileged bitch too. And so to her shame, she wrote, she shut up and just sat there and watched Justine's life get torn apart. And Helen Lewis is a member of the mainstream media and is exactly the sort of person who should be standing up. And so, I think, the best you can hope for is when something like this happens, for there to be a kind of babble of voices discussing it, as opposed to one voice that's so frightening that everybody else is cowed into silence.
Yeah, and I mean, to me as a musician, the Randy Newman example is so interesting because it was a totally different time. He was using racist language that was clearly intended to be satirical, and it was the early 70s, and he had the mainstream media explaining exactly what was going on, that this was satire. Yeah. And you wonder, putting out a record like Good Old Boys in 2015, whether he would have even had the chance to say, this is satire, before Twitter put the kaboom on something like that.
Although saying that, short people would have short people parties where they would throw eggs at Randy Newman's face, that poster. So there was a bit of a backlash even to him.
Right,
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Old school backlash. I want to talk just about a very general topic, which is what it's like to be a best-selling outsider. Now, there's been kind of a through line through your work, from Psychopath Tests through Frank. How many people here have seen the movie Frank? Okay, enough for me to talk about it, I think. To the new book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Always in your work, you are sticking up for outsiders, those who have been shamed, humiliated, ostracized. So I'm just contrasting where you were when you started writing books like this to where you are now. You are a best-selling author. You have earned the approval of the majority of mainstream media, let's say. So I just wanted to ask kind of a losing your edge question.
Honestly, when I was starting out, I was much more, because I was young and I thought I knew it all and nothing particularly bad had happened to me. And so I would go and meet, like in the early days, I'd hang out with neo-Nazis or militant Islamists or conspiracy theorists, and with all my kind of urbane, baggage intact. Yeah. I remember I was outed. Oh my goodness, I was outed as a Jew at a jihad training camp one time in Gatwick Airport. Omar Bakri saying, "Look at me with the infidel John, who is a Jew." And everyone went, "Ah!" I said, surely it's better to be a Jew than an atheist. And someone in the crowd went, no, it isn't. To this day, I don't know why I even said that, because I'm an atheist. But then, you know what, something happened.
I knew I should have brought a snare drum to this interview.
But, you know, this is leading to an answer to that question, which is that, so I thought I knew all the answers, and I thought I was kind of better than the people I was writing about. And then I tried to sneak in about 1996, I tried to sneak into this secret club called the Bilderberg Group, where the secret rulers of the world apparently plot global domination. And I got chased away by men in dark glasses. A car chase ensued through the streets of Portugal. I say a car chase. I was going 30 miles an hour and so was he. But if I had gone faster, he would have gone faster. Like if I was going like 50, I can't actually think of a speed higher than 50.
This wasn't the French Connection, in other words.
I'm like an old lady from a Quentin Blake book. And I got terrified, and I phoned up the British Embassy, and I said, I'm being followed by the Bilderberg Group. And the woman from the British Embassy went, and then she went, go on. She said, the good news is if you know you're being followed, they're just trying to intimidate you. The dangerous ones would be those that you don't know are following you. But I thought, what if they are the dangerous ones, and I just have to be like naturally good at spotting them? And so, anyway, I think that day, that was a bit of a sort of breakthrough for me that day, because I thought, I have become the people I'm writing about. Like I am now very paranoid and very frightened, and then both in my personal life and in my work, I met more and more damaged people. And I empathized with them, because when you meet people, you empathize with them, and I saw the world through their eyes, and I know in my personal life, bad things happen, so I understood what it was like to kind of be in pain. And so actually, my work gets more and more. I don't know why there's people sometimes say you get more conservative as you get older. I really don't understand that, because as you get older, you get hurt, and when you're hurt, you understand the pain of other marginalised people, and so you become more liberal. And
may it be so for all of us.
It baffles me that it's not so for all of us. Yeah. So actually, the older I get, the more I empathise with the people I'm writing about, to the extent that I kind of only really want to write about kind of wronged people I can write about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, you got off of that one. I want to ask about one of the stories that I found more interesting in the new book, which is the story of Jonah Lehrer. Not necessarily a sympathetic character, but then again, many of the people in this book are not, on first glance, sympathetic characters. I'll tell the story very briefly, but he was called out for a best-selling book called Imagine How Creativity Works.
He had faked Bob Dylan quotes.
Yes.
He'd quoted Bob Dylan as saying that creativity was just a hard thing to describe. It's just the sense that you've got something to say. And a keen Dylanologist called Michael Moynihan, reading this, thought
that Dylan would never say something.
Yeah, because Dylan was like an asshole.
Right, right.
This sounded like Jonah Lehrer.
Dylan wasn't writing self-help books.
Yeah.
So when we leave Jonah Lehrer in your book, he has been profoundly shamed. You wonder if he's ever going to work again. He's been forced to give an apology speech while there is a feed of Twitter tweets, I believe they're called, running behind his head.
I should explain this. So basically, he has the chance to publicly apologize. This is about a year after he was cast out at a lunch given by the Knight Foundation. And they were live streaming his apology and had erected this giant screen Twitter feed so anybody watching at home could tweet their ongoing opinion of Jonah's pleas for forgiveness. And there was this other monitor screen, so Jonah was reading every tweet as he was And the tweets that were coming in were Jonah Lehrer boring us into forgiving him. And Jonah Lehrer is just a frigging sociopath, just like the daughter of a mining billionaire, dehumanizing words. I mean, imagine if this was an actual court and the accused was in the dock and people were yelling out, bored, sociopath.
Yeah. But it certainly seems like he's undergoing a medieval punishment. Watching him do that, he is on his knees, pretty desperate guy when you're hiking with him through Los Angeles, as you are in the book. And then that's all we know of him from the book. Now, since then, Jonah Lehrer has staged a comeback. He is going to be back in the media in a big way. He has an upcoming book about the science and redemptive power of love, which will be published by Simon & Schuster. So I just wanted to revisit that story. Has he paid his debt? Does this make the shaming somehow seem more legit since he is now back on his feet and potentially has another nonfiction bestseller on his hands?
Well, I mean, let's see if it's a bestseller for a start.
Okay.
We'll see. I mean, my guess is that the book is going to bomb.
Okay.
Because people aren't ready to give him another chance. I mean, but we'll see. I mean, this is I've no idea. That's totally a guess.
I think people will buy it out of a sense of fascination. And I also think that this pop science genre, which I succumb to on a regular basis.
Oh, really? I don't like it.
I know you're very much against it.
Yeah.
I love very simple books that tell me one big change I need to make in my life.
That means you're like Twitter. You're just like black and white. See, I like contradictions and everything being a big mess.
Right.
I mean, I'm not like Jonah Lehrer's defender. I'm not like a sort of shame imam. I mean, I guess my personal view is that I believe in the concept of re-entry. And I totally get that Jonah Lehrer, as a kind of preppy, handsome, wealthy, or presumably formerly wealthy white man, has privileges that other people don't get. But at the same time, if you believe in the concept of re-entry, you should believe in that concept for for more less sympathetic people.
Yeah.
So my view is, he's been out in the wilderness for nearly 4 years now, and if he does do okay with this book, that's fine by me.
Right. I mean, in his case, I think there's a blurred line between the concept of re-entry and the concept of capitalism, of simply seeing, there's a market for me again, and I'm going to jump in. I mean, I was duking it out with somebody on Facebook yesterday, Facebook being a much more subtle medium than Twitter. And this person was arguing, Jonah Lehrer fabricated quotes. As a journalist, that's the death penalty. He should not be allowed to work again. And my response to that is, well, that's all fine and good, but who's going to enforce that? If the market's not enforcing that, then indeed he can write another book, which is what he's doing. And I guess what you're saying is it's up to the public to decide whether to reward that with commercial gain.
Well, there's a British guy who's very similar to Jonah Lehrer called Johann Hari, who committed similar transgressions, was in the wilderness for about 3 years, and came back this year with a book about addiction called Chasing the Dragon, I think. And it's done well. He gave a TED Talk, which was very popular. It was a well-researched book, apparently. He put all his audio interviews online so anybody could check the quotes and so on. And I kind of think, what are we? Are we like hanging judges? Are we like the people in the lithographs being ribald at whippings? I think, he came back and good luck to him.
Right.
Yeah. As I say, like, I'm not, you know, this is I think this is different to what my book's about, because actually Jonah Lehrer is kind of different to the other people in the book, in that he did do something that was wrong. And my book was never about trying to mitigate what Jonah Lehrer did. It was more about, you know, what happened to him when he tried to apologize, and also this kind of, you know, tense human story of the relationship between Jonah and the man who discovered Jonah's sins and so on.
Right.
You know, which was a kind of incredibly dramatic story, which was, you know, it nearly crushed Michael as much as it did Jonah. And so me saying, fine, you know, it's 3 or 4 years later, and if he's really worked hard, and if he's corrected his faults, fine.
Rehabilitation.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, this is a humanities festival. This isn't like some kind of fucking, you know, Louisiana
we are in a law
courtroom.
school, though.
This isn't 3 strikes and you're out. Well, you know, we are in a law school, and, you know, lawyers are taught the justice system in good societies, you know, written into it is the concept of rehabilitation.
Right.
You know, I know this is like kind of, I know with social media it's like year 0 of justice,
Yes.
but
Yes.
frankly, you know, all those old books on the shelves of courts are there for a reason.
I'm going to try to ask one tiny other question based on my personal interest of the pop science genre, of Malcolm Gladwell and Jonah Lehrer and other titans of subtlety. So you do bring up this genre in the book as an extension of your conversation with Jonah Lehrer, just kind of pointing out how Gladwell also got in trouble for oversimplifying the decrease in crime in New York City with the broken windows.
Yeah, I mean, what basically Malcolm Gladwell gave, you know, I mean, you know, like there's a lot of Malcolm Gladwell stuff I like, but honestly, Malcolm Gladwell got famous by giving liberal New Yorkers permission to be more conservative and support Giuliani's policy, because he wrote about it in the New Yorker.
Right. And then he recanted. Like you talked to him about that, and he did express remorse about.
He was too in love with the kind of simplicity. Basically, Malcolm Gladwell, for people who don't know, Malcolm Gladwell wrote this essay, "The Tipping Point," which approved of Mayor Giuliani's policy that the way to stop murders would be to arrest graffiti artists and turnstile jumpers. And so Giuliani arrested all the graffiti artists and turnstile jumpers, and lo and behold, all the murders stopped.
Right.
But, you know, there's been much evidence since that the murder rate was going down across America at exactly the same rate, including in big cities like, I think, Chicago. Where broken windows hadn't been implemented. And when you think about it, how is arresting a turnstile jumper going to stop a murder unless the turnstile jumper's off to murder someone?
Certainly is mostly the case.
And I know it's kind of a bit more complicated than that, because making I know it's a bit more complicated, but frankly, you know, this policy has been debunked now, including by Malcolm Gladwell himself.
So right before I kick it to Q&A, I just have to ask, is there anything in the pop science genre that's worth reading?
Have I read any pops? What I love is finding, I love reading academic papers and buried away within them, academic psychology papers. Yeah. Hey, no, I'll tell you who's good. I've just been reading Albert Bandura. I've just started reading him. Does anybody know him? Moral disengagement in the perpetration of inhumane acts. He would include calling Justine Sacco the daughter of a mining billionaire as an excuse to commit inhumane acts on her.
Great.
I don't know if he would count as pop science, but he has just written a pop psychology book about moral disengagement, which is about to come out, which is quite brilliant.
Great. I think I'm abusing my privileges here, so thank you very much, and we'll kick it to Q&A.
I'm so glad I'm not the person who has to make the decision. Whenever two hands go up at once, I get incredibly
Terrible.
overwhelmed. Yeah.
You would be the hanging judge in that case.
You know what? I would make a terrible Sophie in Sophie's Choice. I'd go like, oh, kill both my children. Oh, hey.
Well, my question is sort of like, empathy is definitely the big key, but could you give some examples of how empathy has been used within the social media areas so we can learn how to maybe do it right?
Well, I mean, the best empathy researcher that I met when I was researching this book was this incredible prison psychiatrist called James Gilligan, who was a Harvard psychiatrist who spent his life inside Walpole and other maximum security prisons and secure hospitals in Boston. And he came to the conclusion, like every single murderer, I mean, I know, you know, this, he extrapolates a bit in a way that I don't totally love, but I think that the core of what he writes about is incredible, where he says that every single murderer that he treated over his entire long career was harbouring a central secret. And that secret was that they felt ashamed, like deeply ashamed, like as children they were beaten, pimped out by their parents, and so on. And the conclusion he came to was that all violence is an attempt to replace shame with self-esteem. And actually, funnily enough, Jonah Lehrer, when he was, he says that one thing he discovered from being with all of these murderers in prison was that once they were shamed to an extreme degree, something clicked off, like they no longer felt pain, what they felt was a numbness. And he said it's no surprise that the lower circle of hell in Dante isn't a circle of flames, but a circle of ice, absolute coldness. And when I was interviewing Jonah Lehrer, talking about the Twitter feed, he was trying to apologise in front of the Twitter feed, he said at one point I had to switch something off inside of me. It was like I had to emotionally shut down. So I think in that moment, Jonah Lehrer experienced a little bit of what those prisoners that James Gilligan always worked with experienced. And in terms of empathy on social media, I mean, it does feel this year that a little group of us have started standing up for the shamed, like the shamed that we feel it's appropriate to stand up for, like, for instance, the people in the Ashley Madison some of the people in the Ashley Madison hack. It's people like Glenn Greenwald and Monica Lewinsky and Brene Brown. And, sort of just reminding people that compassion and curiosity and empathy is actually, if you really want to make the world a better place, those things work better than shame. Which isn't to say, I mean, I'm not as radical about this as Brene Brown. I mean, Brene Brown would say that shame never works. But, you know, we were talking about Jonah Lehrer. I'm thinking about the Instagram comedian Fat Joe, who was stealing people's jokes and had a shaming and doesn't steal people's jokes anymore. And it's hard for me to see that. I mean, some of the language against him got very violent, but it's hard to see that as a particularly inappropriate set of circumstances. Yeah.
One of the things that you said was driving this phenomenon is the concept of privilege, and you used that word a few times, and many in the room would probably agree that we've heard so much about that word in the last year and a half than maybe my entire life in the public discourse. Right. How much do you think it's our society's focus on the whole privilege concept that's driving this more than the desire to just get people, and is that going to work itself out?
Right. I mean, it dawned on me at one point during all of this that, you know, of course, getting people who have misused their privilege is a better thing to get people for than the stuff that we used to get people for, like having children out of wedlock. But the problem is that the phrase misuse of privilege has become this free pass to tear apart like anybody we choose to. In fact, can I give you a really quick example? I was going to read this out and then I didn't, but this train crashed in Philadelphia earlier this year, and 8 people were killed, and a woman emerged from the wreckage and tweeted, "Thanks for derailing my train. Can I please get my violin back from the second car of the train?" So I think in the early days of Twitter, when it was still a place of curiosity and compassion, people would say, oh my God, how are you okay? What was it like? Oh, thank you. And but that's not how Twitter responded this year. This is how Twitter responded. Some spoiled asshole is whining about her violin being on that Amtrak that derailed. People died on that train, and she's an idiot. And, hang on. I hope the violin is crushed, and I hope someone picks it up and smacks it against the train. And fuck that little bitch and her goddamn violin. I would slap the fucking taste out of her mouth if she was in reach, little asshole. And then she deleted her Twitter account, and people were tweeting, too bad she's a coward, and deleted her account. How will her violin ever be returned? And 8 people dead, but she lives. No justice in the world. So she was perceived to have misused her privilege. But the fact is, a woman who had just been in a train crash was being accused by thousands of people who hadn't just been in a train crash of misusing her privilege. So that's what I mean when I say I think it's becoming this free pass to destroy. I am now kind of mistrustful of people who use that word for that reason, which isn't to say I don't understand the nature of privilege.
Is part of the problem of the shaming of that woman and the shame of you, political correctness gone amok?
I bring my own baggage to that because, I personally consider myself, a politically correct person. Like I believe in, I understand the power of language. When I was growing up in the 1970s, the shows on Saturday night TV were racist and homophobic, and now they're not anymore. And I think political correctness has got a lot to do with that. So I don't, I think it's more that it comes from this place of, there's this kind of idealistic desire to be compassionate, and the desire is so strong, we're picking on people who don't deserve it.
I work in social media, and by the way, thank you for the retweet earlier today. Appreciate it.
Oh.
I wonder, too, about some of the privacy issues that we're seeing from social media. Like, I think it was this week, there was an Alabama teacher who dressed in blackface, and social media went crazy on this couple. And it was from their private Facebook. Somebody had posted a picture of their private Facebook account. And all of a sudden, they're doing a press release, and the New York Post is writing about it. And I was just wondering how you felt about that aspect.
Yeah. Even Justine Sacco, who tweeted that joke to her 170 followers, lots of people, of course, said, well, it's her own fault. She should know that being on Twitter is like yelling something out over the microphone at Madison Square Garden. But Justine had 170 Twitter followers. Like, nobody ever replied to any of her jokes. So nothing like that had ever happened before. And I think even she, broadcasting out into the world, had a realistic expectation of nothing happening while she was asleep on the plane. So yeah, everyone's fair game now. And there's this terrible symbiotic relationship between the mainstream media and social media, which I think is really corrosive. And a good example of it from the other week was the woman who apparently sued her nephew for jumping into her arms and saying, I love you, auntie, and got like a bad wrist. And so the mainstream media picked this up and went for it, and then social media went insane, which gave the mainstream media like this other excuse to do more stories about it because social media was so angry. And then a couple of days later, somebody came along and said, oh, no, you've got this completely wrong. She had to use that language because of the loopholes in the medical insurance. She had to sue the medical insurance people, and everyone was like... And so social media, instead of saying, oh, my God, Twitter's this terrible information swapping service, we really should wait for more evidence... Twitter didn't say that. Twitter said, those fucking mainstream media bastards giving us bad information. So, that's where we are right now. And quite honestly, I think, until that's broken, until we see abuse of power wherever it comes from, there's going to be, more and more suicides.
Okay, I think that's an upbeat place to end.
Thank you.